and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. This is The Full Scottish and I'm Kenny McBride. And today, since it's very nearly the end of the year, we're going to take a wee look back and see some of the highlights of The Full Scottish for the last couple of months. So we're starting just back at the beginning of September. We're going to take you through to the end of October, and then next week we'll have a wee look at November and December to see how we've finished out the year. So we are going back to the old studio, so that should be fun. But our very first clip is Jeanette Fogo and Peter Arnott talking to us about the rise of Boris Johnson over the summer and what he was planning to do in Parliament in the autumn. So we've got that, then there's a wee clip from John Swinney from All Under One Banner in Perth, and then a whole lot of other clips. So do enjoy them. I'll be back at the end to wrap up. Cheers.
Is it just desperation, or are we actually now seeing such a move to the right by this government and probably subsequent governments that this is the kind of thing we're just going to have to expect in future?
Well, personally, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if ideology comes into it that much for the likes of Boris Johnson. I think there are.
He has no ideology, perhaps?
None at all. I don't, any more than Trump does. I think, but just as Trump has been forced, in a sense, has used the right-wing ideology to gain power, so indeed I think it's Boris Johnson, but will probably have to get more right-wing to maintain power. I mean, if Donald Trump is in the position now of either he stays president forever or he goes to prison, I mean, those are his two alternatives. That, roughly speaking, I think Boris Johnson is going to find himself in a similar position. But I agree with Jeanette that this is not about Brexit, really. It's about using Brexit to get 5 years number 10 Downing Street. It's more than it's about getting 10 Downing Street to deliver Brexit, because that's just the cover story, I think.
Jeanette, it also seems to me like, it's like, look at Boris Johnson, you know, we've all loved to laugh at him. And I saw a thing recently, I think it was on Twitter, from the pre-referendum campaign, and it was Blair McDougall on Question Time talking about Boris Johnson's not even a member of Parliament, how he's ever going to be Prime Minister, blah, blah, blah. And I remember I don't remember seeing that actual programme, but it never occurred to me that it was impossible that Boris Johnson could be where he is now. My cousin lives in his constituency in London. They're very kind of left-wing Labour voting people, and she said they never had any doubt that once he was coming back, he was coming back. And I feel it's like, with people like Boris Johnson, it's like the psychology of it. The psychology of somebody who believes that they're entitled, believes they should have something, therefore they must have it by any means. Well, and that, to me, that makes him more frightening than a lot of other much cleverer Conservatives who have. I mean, I think like the divide in the Conservative Party at the moment, say between the Ken Clarks and the John Majors. These are all state school boys in Major left school very young. Ken Clark went through his local kind of state secondary, then went on to, I think it was Cambridge. But it's almost like there's a divide in the Conservative Party between the smart boys who made it because they earned it, and the boys who've grown up forever going like, but do we not own the world?
Yeah. Interesting you said how people might have thought, how can he possibly be Prime Minister and he's not a Member of Parliament? Well, we've got someone else who's not a Member of Parliament in the Westminster Parliament, has never been a Member of Parliament in Westminster, and his party have never been elected to Westminster, either of his two parties, and that's Nigel Farage. And yet again this week, the Brexit Party were very clear at the beginning of the week that unless you deselect the 40-odd Tory MPs who they think will vote either for a vote of no confidence or against a Brexit no deal, we will not support you in the general election. In other words, we will put up candidates against you, and this will damage your chance. Now, this is the second time that Nigel Farage effectively has held the country to ransom. If it hadn't been for UKIP and him and the love-in affair with mainstream media with that man, Cameron would never have had the referendum in the first place. So we talk now about everyone's upset and we prorogue Parliament, we must get our democracy back, but you're left wondering, actually, how much democracy has this country seen in the last 7 or 8 years?
I think there are two different conceptions of what democracy means, which probably go, well, if you want to get really scholarly about it, go back to the French Revolution before. One is that democracy is the will of the people, and that's the Jean-Jacques Rousseau stroke Herman Goering, stroke Nigel Farage view of democracy, which is that democracy is some kind of people's will. And then you have what the kind of Edmund Burke version of democracy from the 18th century, which is that democracy is where you elect somebody to exercise their own judgment.
Indeed. Representative democracy.
Representative democracy. And so basically those two theories are running into each other. And that what is happening is that representative democracy has folded like wet broccoli, and in the face of the more powerful will-based politics, which we thought we consigned to history in Nuremberg, but actually has come back with a vengeance, not just in Britain, but also right the way across Europe and across Asia and across the Middle East and South America. So in a sense, I think that's what Farage represents, because Farage holds Parliament in contempt. But now the person running the government, which is not Boris Johnson, which is Dominic Cummings, also holds Parliament and representative democracy in contempt.
Okay, so let's think about that then, because you mentioned Dominic Cummings.
Yeah.
He really seems to be a nasty piece of work, who's kind of emerged from the shadows. And now again, we see yet another female physically escorted out of a building, not that long from the campaigner who was removed from a Tory dinner. Whether or not Khan was responsible for Sonia Khan for the leak, we don't know. Clearly, Javid is up to 99 because no one told him his key aide was being fired. So we're seeing contempt for not just Parliament, but we're seeing contempt for democracy across the board.
Absolutely.
Gove this morning has now come out and seems to have aligned with Brexit Party's view that yes, we probably will have to get rid of these people. And more importantly, on the Andrew Marr show this morning, he actually said, even if Parliament passes legislation to stop a no-deal Brexit, we will not necessarily have to pay attention to it. So what is left for Parliament to do? Can it do anything?
Well,
Jeanette.
well, can it do anything? I don't know. It's the whole thing about this kind of parliamentary democracy and the whole constitutional issue is that you don't have something that you can actually refer back to that's written down that says, like, how does this law tangle with this sense of ourselves which we wrote down and passed, whatever. And so you have, I mean, I've sort of written it down here, it's a favourite word of mine, this thing of precedent, which basically affects English law more than Scottish law, which is more statute-based, as I understand it. Although Scottish law seems now to be one step below the whole kind of idea of the Supreme Court and English law, Westminster, etc. But the thing about precedent is that you have no control subsequently over what that is. So if we are going to... if we decide now, or if it is decided now by whoever that you can't, you don't have to pay attention to anything that Parliament passes, then you don't have to pay any attention to anything that Parliament passes forever.
We are Democrats in Scotland, and we believe in the right of the people of our country to choose our own future. That's the historical roots of Scottish society. It's what we hold dear. It was the opinion that led to the foundation of the Scottish Parliament, the democratic expression of the will of the people of Scotland, and nobody, not Boris Johnson or anybody else, can stand in the way of the democratic wishes of the people of this country.
We heard, of course, you were mentioning the illiberal people joining the Liberal Democrats. They are, of course, led in Scotland by Willie Rennie, who today, or this weekend rather, declared himself anti-democratic. So neither Liberal nor Democratic, Willie Rennie saying no, nay, never to a second independence referendum, even if the SNP and Greens win a comfortable majority. Meanwhile, at the same time, we did get some good news. Herman Van Rompuy, the former president of the European Council, came out and said that Scotland very possibly would be welcome in the EU. He said the decision by the UK to leave the EU had altered European attitudes to independence. He said, I think there is a change, yes, because for a lot of people, they are looking at what Scottish people are in favour of. They want to stay in the European Union, and at the same time, they are prevented to stay in the European Union. This was obviously welcomed by Mike Russell, who said it was a strong contribution, it was a very welcome comments, and that the Independent Scotland wanted to make a strong contribution to the EU. Alistair Jack, the Scottish Secretary, came back and said that Scotland was better served in the EU rather than joining the EU and giving away democratic and fishing rights. Presumably missing the fact that there is a substantial part of our democracy that we've already given away, and we're trying to get back from Westminster. So, what do we think about these different attitudes, where we've got people in Scotland saying we shouldn't even have the chance to vote, and we have people in Europe now saying that there is a clear path towards EU membership for an independent Scotland?
I mean, Willie Rennie's comments are just astonishing. As you say, for somebody who calls himself a liberal Democrat to say people aren't allowed to exercise their right to democracy is mind-blowing. But it speaks to, I think, a very hardcore unionist sense that he and others share, that, you know, there can be no other political entity that is better than the UK. And, you know, if the last 11 years since the financial crash has taught us anything, that it's that our current political system doesn't work. It doesn't serve the needs of many, many people. In Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in Wales, in England, anywhere you look, there are communities that politics is and has been failing. And, you know, I think it's really beholden on those of us who believe in independence as a way to create something different and something better for the people of Scotland. It's our responsibility to work together to ensure that we get the democratic mandate in other ways. I mean, in some ways we already have that. Mm-hmm. The SNP and Greens have the numbers in Holyrood. We know with the Holyrood elections in 2021, they'll be upon us sooner than we think. You know, should that be a fundamental part of those campaigns? Yes, I would say, if we haven't got there beforehand. And I think there are, as I said before, we maybe need to start thinking a little bit differently about how we do this kind of thing, how we ask these kinds of questions in our country. And, you know, with all due respect, and that usually implies very little. So, but yeah, with all due respect, Willie Rennie, you know, he doesn't speak for the majority of Scotland. He doesn't, you know, I doubt, well, he speaks for a very, very small number of people in Scotland if you look at their political representation. And what we need to be absolutely certain that we do across the independent supporting political parties is work with our communities and work with each other to make sure that we know we are on sure footing when we put any kind of question to the people. I think in terms of how our relationship with the EU works, I remember having these discussions 5 years ago. You know, we had the European elections in 2014, and then the EU, and then the independence referendum. Referendum, and then people were saying, "Oh, you have to vote to stay in the UK, to stay in the EU." Well, you know, that's proved to be the lie now that it was then, and at that time there were different officials from the European Union saying, if Scotland wants to come back into the EU or to stay part of the EU, we will find a way to do that. And the whole point of the European project is to be inclusive. There are caveats to that, of course there are. You know, it stops at the eastern boundaries of Europe pretty clearly. You mentioned Turkey earlier on, you know. But in terms of Western Europe, there is no rhyme or reason that the EU would have for turning around to Scotland and saying, no, you can't. I think there's it speaks against the principles of the European project, freedom of movement, you know, freedom of sort of engagement and interaction. And I think that will if you'll pardon the expression, that'll trump any kind of naysayers who say, oh, an independent Scotland will never be allowed back into the EU. Of course we will.
Yeah, well, we certainly hope so. And just as we were mentioning there, how the hard line that the Lib Dems have taken. Now, the Greens are about the same size of party in the Scottish Parliament, but within the Scottish Green Party, there are unionist supporters. There are people who support. I believe Robin Harper was campaigning on the no side in 2014. But the party's official line was always pro-independence. Do you think that's something that parties, particularly, I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see a pro-independence Tories coming out in force, but amongst the Lib Dems and Labour, they have taken this very hard line, unionist line. Do you think it would be easier for them if they were to say, well, actually, we're kind of agnostic, and actually you can vote Labour and be pro-independence, that's okay?
Well, I've always been surprised at the strategic decision taken, maybe more so by Labour than by the Lib Dems, about independence, because the result of their position on even being able to talk about independence within the Labour Party is they lost their support in Scotland. In the Scottish Greens, I think it's slightly different. The party is now overwhelmingly, and I think probably has been for a long time, since before 2014, but certainly since then, overwhelmingly, vast majority of us campaign for and will campaign for independence. But my work with the Scottish Independence Convention and in the independence movement more broadly, it tells me that yes, they're Labour members, Labour supporters who are in favour of independence, and there have always been. And I think it's perhaps something for all party structures to be wary of, saying you can never dissent from the party line. There has to be a way of, as I've said before, dealing with difference, dealing with conflict in a way that is not destructive. And I don't think, generally speaking, in politics or in society, we are very good at doing that. And that's something that I think we have to learn or relearn, because I think certain societies maybe did have it in the past. I know that there are Labour supporting, Labour voting independence campaigners and supporters, and I think actually it would do the Labour Party in Scotland good to say, you're still welcome. We welcome your views. We aren't going to dictate what you can and can't do. And that very hard line that Willie Rennie and Scottish Labour have taken, I think, is damaging to them. It might push more people to the SNP, the Greens, and other pro-indie parties, or to no party, and that's that's sometimes how politics works. But let's actually think about what kind of parties and politics do we want to see in Scotland? Do I want to see parties that don't allow any kind of discussion about things? No, that's not good for politics.
Yeah.
Sticking with Brexit, how just for a little bit longer, Labour Party conference started. We are going to, apparently they're going to debate Brexit tomorrow. Jeremy Corbyn must be the only person in the United Kingdom who wants to stay neutral on this. Now, even the Liberal Democrats, who I often call the party that likes to say maybe, have clearly come out on one particular issue. We might talk about that in a minute. But Jeremy Corbyn wants to stay neutral, and clearly the suggestion is that conference doesn't. So are we set for yet another major falling out amongst thieves in the Labour Party? What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of days?
I mean, predicting the Labour Party is a mug's game. I don't know what will happen. I think Jeremy Corbyn is also the only person in Britain who could lead the Labour Party and not be leading in the polls right now. I mean, that takes a special kind of incompetence to be running, to have had Theresa May, who even at the best of times is not charismatic or likeable at all, and then Boris Johnson, who a vast chunk of the country absolutely despises. That's the two leaders he's been facing at a time when the Tory party has been at war with itself, has been working on an ever decreasing majority in Parliament, has not been able to get anything useful done for 3 years, and he's still not leading in the polls.
But
I mean, it's absurd. I mean, and it kind of came to a head the other week when just before Parliament was prorogued, when after all this time saying we want a general election, we want a general election, we want a general election, the chance came where he could have won a vote of no confidence, and he didn't want it.
Oh, but that's because they knew that Johnson would just lie again and change the date. And I think it wasn't just him. Every other opposition party supported that move. I think that was the right move to take, because you can't just trust Boris Johnson. They had to get the agreement that the letter would be sent. Now it turns out that letter asking for a withdrawal probably hasn't got the legal strength that we thought it did, but that was why they did it. And it was easy for them to call him chicken, but I think it was quite a strategic move.
I understand that there was reason behind it, but it looks so weak. I think a lot of people will not have seen, oh well, you know, I kind of understand why they did that. A lot of people will look at it and go, Corbyn just doesn't have a spine. He can't, because
but worse than not having a spine,
if he can't be leading in the polls now, he can't win at all.
Worse than not having a spine, if the Labour Party do not have a clear, identifiable policy on Brexit, that in itself is going to make a no-deal Brexit exit likely, don't you think?
Well, if we can't get a majority in Parliament for something other than a no-deal Brexit, yes, we get a no-deal Brexit. We can't keep postponing indefinitely. But I think you're maybe being a bit unfair on Jeremy Corbyn, because going back to what you said earlier about Boris Johnson trying to pit the people against Parliament, in a sense, the people have been pitted against Parliament right from the word go in the Brexit process, and this has been a major issue. We had a narrow majority to leave in the referendum, but clearly we had about 70% support for Remain in Parliament, and for the major parties to try and negotiate that has been very, very difficult. Now the Lib Dems have staked out a very strong we'll just revoke position, but that doesn't go down well with a lot of people. I mean, I was in a taxi this morning.
It's neither Liberal nor Democratic, I would suggest.
I was in a taxi this morning and the taxi driver said, I don't really care whether we leave or remain, but the people voted, we should just get on with it. These MPs are standing in the way. You know, that attitude is out there. So Labour, who have to, if they're going to govern, have to appeal to a broad church, are in a very, very difficult position. They don't have the luxury of the Lib Dems of hoovering up the ultra Remain vote
and knowing that they'll never be in power, so the revoking Article 50 is not.
Moving on, we do have a fairly big event happening next weekend, Andrew.
Yes, indeed.
We have the All Under One Banner March happening in Edinburgh. Would you like to just tell us a wee bit about what's happening and what you're expecting?
Next Saturday, the 5th of October, the All Under One Banner organisation hopes to see the climax or the peak of a succession of marches that have been held in towns and cities across Scotland this year. I became involved in the organisation at the Edinburgh March last year, and I found it such a positive and inclusive and constructive and fun event that I decided to help support that organisation. And so this year, whilst the plans for next year are now set out, and there are 7 marches that are now in the process of being arranged for 2020, everyone involved would like to see the march in Edinburgh next weekend as being the peak of this year's succession of marches. We are certainly hopeful of seeing we're seeing more than 200,000 people marching together, literally all under one banner. The point in the organisation is that it is non-political. It is open for anybody and everybody and their dogs to come and walk and march and make their feelings with regard to independence known. The march will start at Holyrood Park at 1 o'clock sharp. The march will then march up the Royal Mile, along George IV Bridge, along Forest Road, Middle Meadow Walk, and then we'll come to a conclusion with a rally in the Meadows on the south side of Edinburgh. I should say that because the march is regulated by the City of Edinburgh Council, the arrangements and the plans are always subject to the control of the Council. However, as the matters are planned at the moment, as I've said, we'll depart from Holyrood Park at 1 o'clock sharp, and we'll march up the Royal Mile and towards the Meadows. As I say, I found the march last year incredibly positive and incredibly inclusive, and that encouraged me to stay involved. And I have certainly found that, in my opinion, others who have been involved, I think it's been obvious that people keep coming back again and again, and because they enjoy the event so much, because it is so inclusive, so positive, and it is such a constructive movement. I think at the time where we see occasionally political movements that maybe described as being slightly darker, I think in sharp contrast, the movement that is represented by All Under One Banner is the diametric opposite to that. All ages, all backgrounds, inclusive of everyone, and as all of the press coverage, such as there has been, will show, you see all of the smiling, happy faces. You see how much fun people are having at these events, both on the marches and at the rallies. So I'm looking forward to next weekend tremendously.
And you talked about the push for independence. So obviously yesterday in Edinburgh, there was a pretty clear physical manifestation of that desire. I think certainly the biggest All Under One Banner march, and probably as big, if not bigger, than the Stop the War Coalition march that happened in Edinburgh. What are we going to have to do to persuade Westminster that there is a growing clamour for another referendum and for independence, especially when the polls are not really showing the sort of gap that anecdotally we're all aware of ourselves from people we know who've changed their mind. So what do we need to do, Kenny?
I don't think the problem is convincing Westminster that the desire is there. I don't think that's ever been the problem. I think we keep hearing this argument that, we need to get to 60% in the polls and, get that consistently, and that'll prove that it's real. And I mean, first of all, we're never going to get 60% consistently in the polls before there's a vote. It won't happen. And besides, there are probably 40% of Scots who will never vote for independence under any circumstances. So you'd be looking at effectively having every possible convertee converted before we even announced a vote. The problem is not, I think, that Westminster thinks, why waste time on a vote that's going to go the same way? Their thing is, why allow a vote that's going to go the way we don't want it to? And I don't know that increasing our support in the polls is actually going to help with that.
But at least it then stops the argument that there's no desire for this, and we can shout back, oh yes there is, and it just becomes a pantomime, and that's not leading us anywhere. So it's proving, and it's interesting that certainly on News at 10 last night, the march wasn't covered at all. So if you didn't watch any evening news, there was a bit of a mention, I think, on the sort of early evening news, and you're living in the rest of the UK, you didn't know it happened. And obviously England is considerably larger, public opinion in England is important in this matter, and it's all being filtered, so they're not aware of it. So I'm sure you probably did, as I did, on social media, let English friends know that this had been happening, just in case they believed that there was no interest in independence. But I mean, the game is changing even more than having to prove we've got an interest. There's been suggestions from the Lib Dems before they decided just to rip up Article 50 should they ever get into power, unlikely clearly, that there should always be a confirmatory referendum on any other major referendum. So that was obviously, I think, aimed at us. So let's say we have a referendum, we vote to leave the UK, and then when the deal is understood, we have a confirmatory referendum. I don't actually have a problem with that. I think that's absolutely fine. But now the other insidious suggestion is that we would need a 2/3 majority. And it's back to 1979 with the 40% rule, which is what stopped revolution in the first place. They haven't imposed that on any other referendum. That would be manifestly unfair. But that's, to me, feels like the direction of travel. And I'm not convinced we've got an answer to any of that or a strategy for it. And that really worries me.
I think that the strategy has to be incredibly carefully thought out. And there are several stages to the strategy. There's a strategy to get a referendum, and then there's a strategy for what happens during the negotiating period, because we've seen that actually is going to be incredibly key to whether or not, even if we won an independence referendum, whether it would be delivered and on what terms it would be delivered. And of course, the incredibly important thing there, as you say, 40%, I would say probably a little bit less than that, but there's a stalwart unionist movement who are the equivalent of the Remainers, who would be no matter what. We've seen that, you can stall Brexit for an awful long time. We'd be stalling independence for an awful long time. So some of the strategizing could be, ask for a Section 30 mandate and then get turned down. And then suddenly you have the moral high ground because there's no reason to deny a Section 30 vote. All sorts of things could be happening. But the crucial thing is, and I think all of the independence movement have to think about this, not just the political movers and shakers, is how, if we were granted an independence referendum, we would actually get everybody on side, or the people on side, to actually deliver that. Because we've seen the damage that Brexit has done. It hasn't even happened yet, and it's done huge economic and social political damage to the country. It's not likely to go well even if we do have a deal, etc., and we need to learn those lessons incredibly carefully in Scotland. But the other thing, of course, is that we went 17% were in favour of independence prior to the
that's a bit higher,
referendum.
But it wasn't anything like the final figure.
Consistently saying, that they were absolutely. Went from that to 45. So even if the starting point is 48% or whatever it is, what's absolutely clear is there is a huge, we saw in the All Under One Banner March, there is a huge grassroots movement with boots on the ground on the nationalist side, on the independent side, that are willing to do the canvassing, that are willing to do the persuading.
Indeed,
and I'm not at all convinced that happens.
That's the thing.
And that's the starting thing. And I'm not convinced, and I think this is the thing that Westminster will be thinking as well, that the unionist boots on the ground are not there at all. So they are probably going to play a delaying tactic as long as possible until all of this settles down and we return to politics as normal, which is whereby the 40% are actually deciding for the rest of Scotland what's actually happening.
Well, no.
We're joined now by Drew Hendry MP, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy spokesperson for the SNP at Westminster. And Drew, how's your conference so far?
Well, I think it's great. I think we've all got a real buzz from the speech that Ian Blackford made earlier and some of the early motions that we've seen on the floor. It's a great thing to be here and connect with everybody across the SNP family and to be really geared up for what is an exciting future.
And now we've spoken to a couple of MPs already who are all about to hear back down to Westminster. You, though, have a motion to propose tomorrow.
That's right. Our branch in Inverness City has put forward a motion on future maritime trade for Scotland, something that's vitally important if Scotland's going to take its place as an independent member of the European community, to make sure that we've got direct trading links, not just with Europe, but indeed with the rest of the world, and not so reliant on the carbon-eating road transport network that we have for most of our goods and services going down to the south of England and coming from there at the moment.
Now, obviously, as an island nation, maritime issues are quite important. What do you think is the most important thing for Scotland about having those connections?
Well, Scotland's always had ancient connections with the rest of the world. It's a very outgoing country, and for the past 1,000 years we've been trading internationally. What we've lost over the past few hundred years are those direct links to make it easier for us to go out and state our place in the world and maintain that. And of course, over the decades we've lost more and more. It's very important that we use our unique situation, situated as we are with easy access to the north of Europe and, of course, the shortest distance across the Atlantic between Europe and the American mainland, to really take charge of that advantage and make sure that we've got a network of trade that's fit for the future.
Now, obviously that's something that's going to be very important for an independent Scotland, and could be very important even if we weren't to achieve independence. But generally,
which we will.
Absolutely. But generally speaking, industrial strategy are not words that we hear very often in relation to Westminster government. What are you actually trying to achieve in terms of industrial strategy at Westminster now?
Well, Westminster has been absolutely crippled by the Brexit process. It's completely ignored industry and business. And of course, the irony is that the UK government will say they've got an industrial strategy, and they'll pin lots of good-sounding things onto that, like electric vehicles, automation, and so forth, technologies of the future. Mm-hmm. But of course, unless it's underpinned with something that matters to business and the economy, it doesn't work. So, for example, every single industrial group that's given evidence to my committee, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee, has said that Brexit's going to be bad for them. The existing situation that they've got is the one that works best for them across every field, from automotive to the nuclear section, to, not that I believe in nuclear, but to retail, to all of the different sections we've interviewed. They've all said the current situation is best for them. Any form of Brexit is going to harm them. So it's an oxymoron for the UK government to say they've got this industrial strategy, because the strategy at the moment is to run it into the ground.
Yeah. So in your other issues, as you say, the supposedly pro-business Tories are doing something that is going to be very bad for a lot of business. But energy is one of your other one of the other parts of your remit, and obviously with climate change being really getting higher and higher on everyone's agenda now, energy is a big issue. What do you think that should be happening at Westminster in relation to the climate just now?
Well, first thing they should do is give us the powers to unlock the rest of our potential. We've done some fabulous work here in Scotland with renewable energy, but that's been done under environmental legislation. What the UK government have done is held back onshore wind, they've held back solar of all things, probably the most benign of all renewable energies, and yet they've been punishing that for the past We need to have a massive rush to renewable electrification, and instead what the UK government have been doing is investing money in the enormous white elephant that is Hinkley C nuclear power plant and their nuclear obsession. Now, Hinkley is the most expensive object on planet Earth at the moment, and it's a completely failed and wasted technology. We shouldn't be investing in that. They should turn that around and allow us to get on with doing things that are really going to make a difference to the planet and not leave that horrendous legacy into the future. But there's so much that can be done. In Scotland, we've planted 22 million trees. 84% of all of the trees that have been planted in the UK, and we need to do more, but they also need to do their bit as well. Westminster is talk tough and talk big on their 2050 target. In Scotland, of course, it's 2045 for net zero. But actually what they're doing is not delivering on the nitty-gritty for it. So with Scotland having all the powers that we need to do this, we can actually show the undeniable way forward for other countries to take advantage of the revolution that's in front of us to make sure that we're really tackling climate change.
And to tie two of those things together, what role will that green energy sector play in an independent Scottish industrial strategy?
Well, we're going from a place where we've had oil and gas as part of the economic mix. We've never seen the advantage of that, but into a place now where we've got clean, green, renewable energy in abundance. We've got over 25% of Europe's offshore wind and tidal potential. Onshore, we've got still got lots more opportunity, and we've got much more to do and take advantage of. What we can do is make sure that the mistakes that were made by Westminster in the past of not having a sovereign oil fund are actually taken care of in the future, that we have a renewable fund set up, that we're making sure we're taking advantage of our resources. But key to this will be maximising our potential from carbon capture, utilisation and storage. Scotland has an abundant potential with existing infrastructure to take carbon back out of the atmosphere, back out of the fossil fuels that we're using just now, and put it back under the ground using the same technology that we extracted it from. And to give you an example, St Fergus, which is not far from this exhibition centre here today, St Fergus has a potential of starting potential of 5.7 gigatons of storage. Now, to put that into context, that's the equivalent of all Scotland's emissions from 2016, 150 times over. Now, that's not only a potential for us to do our bit here locally, but it's our potential for us to do a bit for others as well in terms of taking some of that carbon and putting it back underground.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, planting all those trees is helping with that too, isn't
There's
it?
lots to do. We could and should plant more trees, but I think it's important to show the strides that we're making at the moment in terms of doing that. Scotland is genuinely leading the way in this field. It's been recognised by the United Nations that we are setting an example here. Imagine how much more we could do just with those powers of any other normal independent country to take forward these policies and show, as I say, show the rest of the world not just how it can be done, but how we are actually delivering that.
And before we get to independence, we have a more immediate issue facing us. We have Brexit potentially happening in just a matter of weeks. What's your take on the situation at Westminster just now? Do you see any resolution within the next week or two?
Well, I think it's firstly important to say that Brexit is fundamentally laid bare how broken Westminster is and I think people across Scotland are seeing how useless Westminster has been for Scotland in terms of recognising their needs or taking care of their concerns, not just now but into the future. So over the next week or so, I think we heard from Ian Blackford that what we'll be doing is if the Labour Party and the Lib Dems are not willing to take action, we will, in terms of putting forward a vote of no confidence. There is no such thing as a good Tory government for Scotland, and a Boris Johnson Tory government is the worst possible manifestation of that. So we want him out. We want him out of office. We want the Tories out of office. We want to get this back to the people in a general election so that they can send a clear message that Scotland not only has continued to reject Brexit, but now wants to underline that in terms of returning MPs to Westminster. And then obviously we need to quickly move on to establishing our right to be an independent country through a referendum.
I would just point out, you said there that it couldn't get worse than Boris Johnson government. We did say that about Theresa May.
Well, I've always said Boris Johnson would be being part of Boris Island would always be one of the worst options you could have. However, I take your point, it's not an awful lot worse than the other incarnations.
If there is to be a general election anytime soon, what do you see as the outcome of that?
Well, I think first of all, getting this band of, I think it's fair to say, charlatans out of office, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg and all the rest of them, particularly Dominic Cummings, who's the unelected bureaucrat who's pulling the strings behind this, to get them out of office, and then really to establish the fact that we need to take this back to the people. First of all, the general election, and then of course Scotland needs its choice over its future. So there's a very clear path for me. I think we need to say to the Scottish people, here are your options for the future. You can have more of this that you've seen for the past 3 years, or we can take our place as an independent nation amongst the European nations with an equal seat at the table, showing the same kind of clout that Ireland have been able to demonstrate through this process, and really take things to another level for our people in the future.
And just on that note, just finally, we've heard a lot of people say that after all the chaos of Brexit, people aren't going to want to face the upheaval of pursuing independence. But at the same time, as you said, we've seen how much power Ireland has been able to exert over the UK, despite us being told for most of our lives that Ireland is kind of unimportant and that Ireland basically is just an appendage to the UK. Which way do you think the people of Scotland will go when they're asked the question?
Well, the interesting thing is to actually speak to those people on their own doorsteps, which I do on a weekly basis. We I go around the constituency. Whenever I'm not at Westminster, I'm knocking doors. And it's interesting to see the two types of reaction. One is, we need to do something to get out of this, and that's, a lot of people who support us anyway. But the interesting thing is to see those people who hadn't previously supported us, or people who are genuinely fed up with Brexit, and they'll often say to me, Drew, don't talk to me about Brexit, but then go on to talk for 5 or 10 minutes about Brexit and about the way it's affected them. So people are fed up with this, and they understand what's going on. But also, I sense very, very clearly from people an appetite for change. And that's been borne out in the opinion polls. Opinion poll after opinion poll is showing that people support Scotland's right to have a choice, and more people are showing that they actually want Scotland to exercise that choice to become an independent country. But it's really, really interesting to talk to those no voters from 2014, many whom have changed their minds, but many more who are much, much more uncertain about how solidly against Scottish independence they are, and saying that quite literally they have a choice to make in the future about that. That wasn't a message I got last time out, wasn't even a message I got in 2017, but it's a very loud message I'm getting now.
And Amy, now in London yesterday, we saw what looked like an enormous protest. The report saying around 1 million people gathered, and this was to effectively demand a second referendum. Now, Mike has spoken about that a wee bit. What do you think the impact is of that kind of march? Do you think it resonates with the government at all?
I think it would be nice if it did. I don't think it does. No, I think it's really, really good that people are getting out and standing up for what they believe in, and it's their democratic right to do things like this, and I think it's fantastic. The constituency that I'm hoping to represent voted 71% to remain, which is even higher than the average in Scotland. And I think it's really, really important that people are listened to, and I think the Scottish Government does a really, really good job in listening to people and listening to their views. And if something like this was to happen in Scotland, and the Scottish Government had the power to act on it, we would do so. But unfortunately, I don't think marches like this resonate with Boris Johnson, because he's just, or any of his government in fact, because I think they're just interested in getting Brexit done, as we've heard him say several times.
And Mike, what's your feeling on that? Do you think the movement of people on this issue is going to affect how the government deals with it?
Well, I think it's a factor, and I don't think it's a factor that can be ignored. I think that worldwide, the sight of very large numbers of people protesting against the government registers and protesting in favour of something. That's why marching for independence is also a good idea, because you show what you're in favour of and you mobilise people. That's the other issue. I think people get mobilised. They understand what they're up against and they want to do something about it. So I'm absolutely not against that, but also people have to then convert that appearance at a march into action, into votes, into campaigning for things. It's not enough just to go on a bus somewhere and say that was great, let's go back and go home again. You've got to be active. You've got to be active in the conventional political sphere. You've got to be persuading people to change their votes and to vote for something new. And in the case of independence, that means persuading people to vote for independence. And there are an awful lot of people who, and I meet them every day virtually, who voted no in 2014, who have changed their mind, sometimes with a heavy heart. Sometimes people who absolutely believe that Britain was the right thing, but who then look at it now and say, that's gone, that's over, it's being destroyed. We can do better than this.
And that was most of September and October here on Broadcasting Scotland. We had a lot of great stuff there, stuff I'd almost forgotten that we had done. We had some extremely prescient analysis, certainly, but we also had extensive coverage of the All Under One Banner marches. We've been to every single one of them this year. We had some great coverage from the SNP conference there. You saw us talking to Drew Hendry, but we also spoke to Stuart Hosey, Marie Todd, several others. I'm having a blank just now on all the names we spoke to. Pete Wishart, God, goodness, lots and lots of people anyway. We also, just finally there, we spoke to Michael Russell MSP, and of course we spoke to Amy Callaghan, the candidate who beat Joe Swinson in the recent general election. So as always, this is the place to come if you want to see the stars of the future. Now, this has been a great year for me. I will just point out as well, I do own more shirts than this. It just so happens that all the clips that I was in, I happen to be wearing this one. Thank you. It was a birthday present from my sister. We have done a lot of great coverage this year. As we keep telling you though, and I know this is the wrong time to be telling you right before Christmas, but we do need more money if we're going to keep doing this next year. It's becoming an ever more desperate need. So if you are able to support us in any way, please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/donate. It is becoming kind of urgent. I mean, I know everything looks great here. We've just renovated the studio and everything, but we do have a target there. And if we don't hit that target soon, then unfortunately, Broadcasting Scotland can't keep going. So do please, if you can donate, please do. Please tell your friends. Please tell everyone you know, at least to watch the shows. If people are watching the shows, then I can harass them for money. You don't have to do that personally. But just let people know what we're doing here, because Broadcasting Scotland has the mission to be Scotland's #1 broadcaster, Scotland's best, most thorough, most Scottish broadcaster, a broadcaster that's owned and run and designed to serve Scotland, not to serve the Scottish outpost of a London empire. So as I say, please, if you can, support us. If you can't, don't panic. We will be here for as long as we can, and as long as other people are supporting us. So until then, we will be back next week to wrap up the rest of the year. But until then, do have a wonderful Christmas, and we'll leave you with just this wee video to remind you once again why you should be supporting Broadcasting Scotland. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being with us all year, and we'll see you again very soon.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon as our First Minister has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.